July 2nd, 1944, near Cherbourg in the north of France. A narrow concrete passage cracked open after days of bombardment, and from its darkness, 9 German army nurses slowly emerged. They did not come out to save lives. They came out to surrender. Their white coats, stained brown with dried blood and smoke, hung loosely from exhausted shoulders. Their hands were raised above their heads, stiff and trembling, as their eyes struggled against the daylight they had not seen for days. The evening wind carried the sharp smell of salt and burnt powder across the hillside, mixing with the silence that followed them up from the cave hospital. Just hours earlier, inside that damp underground ward lit only by candles and oil lamps, they had whispered to one another, "The Americans cannot possibly have the medical supplies they claim. It must be propaganda." For years they had believed this completely. They had believed in German medical superiority. They had believed that American medicine was weak, improvised, and undisciplined. But nothing in their training could prepare them for what waited above ground. Inside the cave, they had spent their final days stitching wounds by firelight, rationing the last drops of morphine, boiling bandages again and again, and watching young soldiers die from infections no one could stop. It was medicine closer to the Middle Ages than the 20th century. And in only a few hours, they would step into a world that shattered everything they thought they knew. Operating tents lit like day, blood plasma stored in chilled containers, penicillin administered without hesitation, machines that breathed and suctioned and illuminated as if powered by another century. Yet the greatest shock would not come from the supplies or the technology or the abundance. It would come from something far more dangerous to the ideology they served. The Americans treated German prisoners the same way they treated their own wounded. This is the story of how a single encounter on a cloudy July afternoon above the bunkers of Cherbourg began the collapse of an entire belief system. A story of how 9 nurses, stepping from darkness into blinding light, were forced to confront a truth they had never imagined. Medicine built on science and compassion destroys medicine built on ideology. July 2nd, 1944. The sky over northern France hung heavy with a sheet of gray clouds, as if still echoing the bombardments that had shattered Cherbourg's defenses for weeks. On the rocky slope near the ruined fortifications, a concrete blast door had been forced open. From the depths of that darkness, 9 women in tattered white coats slowly emerged. They did not come out as healers. They came out as prisoners. Their boots scraped the stones, leaving faint marks on the ground. Their medical uniforms, bleached, torn, stained with dried blood, hung loosely like remnants of a world collapsing behind them. Their hands were raised, palms open, signaling surrender under the Geneva Convention. They squinted in the daylight. It was the first sunlight their eyes had touched in days. The sea wind carried a bitter mixture of salt and gunpowder, drifting across their faces. For a moment, none of them spoke. None of them dared to. The silence was heavier than the smoke-filled air they had left behind. Hours earlier, inside the cave-like hospital burrowed beneath Cherbourg's concrete, they had whispered, "The Americans cannot possibly have the medical supplies they claim. It must be propaganda to break our morale." They spoke these words with conviction, words built on years of Nazi instruction, on lessons that declared German medicine superior and American medicine decadent and weak. These beliefs had become a kind of armor. They were certain. They were confident. But this confidence was about to collapse. Inside the bunker below, they had treated the wounded by candlelight, stitching torn flesh with shaking hands, rationing the last vials of morphine, boiling bandages until the cloth nearly dissolved. Infections spread like wildfire. Amputations were performed without proper anesthesia. Tools were cleaned with boiling water because disinfectant had run out long ago. The nurses believed the Americans must have been equally desperate. They believed the enemy was suffering the same scarcity. They were wrong. Within hours, they would witness operating tents lit with blinding clarity, surgeons working with suction devices and sterilizers powered by portable generators, blood plasma chilling in refrigerated containers, penicillin injected as casually as saline. They were about to witness a level of medical abundance that contradicted everything the Reich had taught them, and the shock would tear through their medical understanding, their assumptions, their ideology, their identity. The collapse had begun long before Cherbourg, over a year earlier, on another battlefield entirely. Tunisia, 1943. To understand the collapse of belief that began at Cherbourg, one must step back into the broader landscape of the German medical system during the war. A system built for quick victories, not prolonged struggle. A system designed for blitzkrieg, not attrition. When the war began, Wehrmacht medical doctrine assumed that battles would be brief, casualties manageable, supplies replenished quickly, front lines mobile. That doctrine did not survive past 1942. After Stalingrad, after the collapse in North Africa, after Allied bombers severed supply lines, German medicine began to fall apart. Hospitals lacked disinfectants. Field stations operated without proper anesthesia. Trained personnel were spread thin across collapsing fronts. By mid-1944, German medical units were overwhelmed. There were no reserves of morphine, no plasma, no penicillin. Bandages were washed and reused until they shredded in the surgeon's hands. When the Allied landings in Normandy opened a catastrophic new front, German medical officers had no option but to burrow deeper into the earth. In Cherbourg, the situation was dire. The city was surrounded. Artillery rained down day and night. No supplies could reach the underground hospitals. The 9 nurses who emerged on July 2nd had spent 5 days underground, breathing the same stagnant air, listening to the ceiling groan under bombardment, losing patient after patient to infections that modern medicine could have stopped instantly. They believed the Americans were suffering the same fate. Their ideology required them to believe it, but this was not the truth. The truth waited outside that bunker, bright, modern, sterile, abundant. As the nurses emerged, American medical trucks were already positioned along the hillside. White ambulances, portable surgical units, supplies stacked with industrial precision. What they witnessed in the next hours would dismantle years of indoctrination. American forward hospitals had fully powered X-ray units, electric suction machines, modern anesthesia, refrigerated medical storage, disposable sterile bandages, blood plasma in quantities the Germans could not imagine, penicillin used without hesitation. In the Reich, such abundance belonged to the realm of fantasy. In the United States, it was standard. The true difference did not lie in the technology alone, but in the philosophy behind it. American medicine served the patient. Nazi medicine served ideology. American nurses were trained to protect the patient, even from a doctor's mistake. German nurses were trained to obey without question. In the hours ahead, the German nurses would confront this clash of philosophies head-on. Among the 9 nurses, military records identify 3 with notable detail. Schwester Ilse Bauer, age 29. Veteran of the Eastern Front, specialist in abdominal wounds and emergency amputations. Raised in Leipzig, firm believer in Aryan medical superiority. Schwester Greta Hoffmann, age 24. Graduate of Munich's Nursing Academy, class of 1941. Served in Crimea, described in Wehrmacht reports as highly ideological, highly disciplined. Schwester Erika Müller, age 31. Senior nurse in the Cherbourg Underground Hospital, trained under Nazi racial medicine curricula. Her diary entry before the fall of Cherbourg read, "We cannot allow American medicine to dominate Europe." None of them knew that they were about to enter a system decades ahead of their own. Three factors made the psychological impact overwhelming. First, propaganda had convinced them America was weak. They believed American medicine was disorganized, poorly trained, racially diluted, technologically inferior. Second, they had never seen medicine industrialized. To them, boiling bandages was normal, missing morphine was expected, lacking antibiotics was routine, losing patients to simple infections was common. Third, they had no framework for medical equality. The Germans had taught them that only racially worthy patients deserved full treatment. They did not expect the Americans to treat German POWs exactly as they treated their own wounded. This contradiction struck the heart of their worldview. To fully understand Cherbourg, one must return to May 13, 1943, Tunisia, where more than 250,000 Axis troops surrendered. Among them were German Red Cross nurses from the Africa Corps. Two became famous for their recorded reactions. Schwester Ilse Schultz, awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. One of fewer than 20 German women ever to receive that medal. Her words after capture were documented. "The Americans throw away more medical supplies in a day than we receive in a month." Schwester Greta Falk, meticulous diarist. Her writings, later found in German archives, described, "They have machines we only saw in textbooks. At first, I thought it was staged for propaganda." These reactions in 1943 foreshadowed the shock awaiting the Cherbourg nurses in 1944. Three forces powered American medical superiority. 1. Industrial production on a scale Germany could not match. Penicillin production, 21 billion units in 1943. 6.8 trillion units in 1945. Bandages, plasma, instruments, all mass-produced. 2. A medical ethic centered on humanity, not ideology. American doctrine required equal care for all wounded, regardless of nationality, ideology, race. 3. A vast training system. By 1944, the United States had trained more than 74,000 military nurses. Germany had no way to compete. Inside the bunker hospital, day -3. 60 severely wounded. 6 cases of advanced infection. 4 amputations. Almost no morphine left. Bandages reused 6 to 7 times. Temperature near 14 degrees Celsius. Water collected from makeshift gutters. Day -2. A 19-year-old soldier died from abdominal trauma. He could not be saved without plasma. They had none. Day -1. A nurse burned her hands when an oil lamp exploded. Day 0. When the Americans breached the bunker, the nurses were manually compressing a soldier's chest in a futile attempt to keep him alive. This was the final image of German wartime medicine. Before they stepped into its opposite, it was not a weapon, not a vehicle, not a tank. It was a white ambulance, pristine, fully equipped, waiting for them. Inside, blood plasma, sealed sterile bandages, portable anesthesia, suction machines, field X-ray cassettes, emergency surgical kits. One nurse whispered, "God in heaven, this is impossible." But it was not impossible. It was American. They had not yet seen the full system, not the giant evacuation hospitals, not the training programs, not the American philosophy of medicine, but their collapse had already begun. The moment the ambulance doors closed, they left behind the world they knew, a world of scarcity, ideology, and obedience, and entered a world where medicine was a machine of healing, powered by science, fueled by industry, guided by humanitarian principles. None of them understood it yet, but the next weeks would reshape them forever. As the American convoy pulled away from Cherbourg, the 9 nurses believed they were being taken to a prisoner camp. They were wrong. They were being taken into the core of American wartime medicine, into operating tents brighter than daylight, into wards where German prisoners were treated as equals, into classrooms where American doctors would challenge everything the Reich had taught them. Cherbourg was only the beginning. The true transformation, the turning point, would come in the field hospitals, the evacuation centers, and eventually across the ocean in the United States. The convoy carrying the 9 nurses moved inland from Cherbourg, passing through fields still scarred by shell fire. Columns of American trucks rolled beside them. Supply vehicles, surgical teams, mobile X-ray units, and ambulances filled with equipment the Germans had never imagined could exist at the front. When the trucks finally stopped, the nurses were ordered to step down. They expected a prison camp. They expected barbed wire. What they found instead was the 45th Evacuation Hospital, a sprawling network of tents, generators, sterilization units, and operating theaters spread across the fields like an industrial complex made of canvas and steel. Erika Muller stood frozen. This cannot be a field hospital," she whispered. Ilse Bauer answered quietly, "It's larger than the University Hospital in Leipzig." The moment they crossed the cordon rope, the turning point began, not with words but with the overwhelming noise of American medicine in motion. Generators roared. Autoclaves hissed. Suction machines droned steadily. Plasma bottles clinked as corpsmen rushed past. To the nurses, it was like stepping into another century. Their first assignment was the shock ward, a high-intensity unit where American doctors stabilized the most critically wounded before surgery. Inside the tent, everything moved with machine-like precision. Nurses in clean white uniforms moved between cots, checking pulses, adjusting oxygen, preparing plasma. And then came the moment that broke their confidence for the first time. A young American soldier, barely 20, was carried in with a chest wound. He was pale, barely conscious. Within 60 seconds, an IV line was secured. Plasma was flowing. Oxygen was administered. A suction device kept his airway clear. A surgeon was already reviewing X-rays taken minutes earlier. It was a choreography the Germans had never witnessed. In Germany, this boy would have been dead upon arrival. Here he was stabilized in less than 5 minutes. Greta Hoffmann whispered, "This is not field medicine. This is something else." The American lieutenant beside her simply said, "This is standard." The 9 nurses were instructed to observe a thoracic operation. They stepped into the surgical tent, and what they saw froze them in place. Bright electric surgical lamps flooded the tent with light as sharp as day. 4 surgeons worked silently, assisted by 2 anesthetists and 3 nurses. Instruments were arranged on stainless steel tables covered in sterile cloth. Ilse could barely speak. They have enough gauze for 100 operations. But the moment that shook them most was this. A corpsman tossed a used bandage into a disposal bin. A disposal bin. It was the exact opposite of what the Reich had taught them. Not scarcity, but abundance, not improvisation, but precision. The operation lasted 40 minutes. The patient left the tent alive. 2 hours later, the nurses witnessed the next blow to their worldview. A soldier with a deep leg wound showed signs of infection. In German conditions, amputation would be the only option. The American surgeon ordered, penicillin, high dose, start immediately. A nurse prepared it without hesitation. 90,000 units. Just for the first injection. Erica felt her knees weaken. She had treated hundreds of infections on the Eastern Front, all without antibiotics. "How much do you use each day?" she asked. The American lieutenant answered, "As much as needed." This sentence followed them like an echo. As much as needed. Not as much as rationed. Not as much as allocated. Not as much as politics permit. It was medicine without ideological chains. In the next ward, they saw rows of refrigerated containers filled with plasma. Hundreds of bottles. Enough to save thousands of lives. The Americans explained the system: typed plasma, cross-matching, long-term chilled storage, rapid distribution, transfusions at the front within minutes of injury. Germany had attempted plasma programs, but failed due to shortages, ideology, and resource collapse. For the nurses, this was not simply a technological shock. It was a moral one. "How many would we have saved?" Ilse whispered. Greta's hands trembled. Tens of thousands. That afternoon, a group of wounded German POWs arrived. Among them were 2 men the nurses recognized, soldiers left behind in the collapsing bunker hospital they had just escaped. The Americans treated them immediately, without hesitation. One soldier, Paul Reiner, was in septic shock. American doctors cleaned the wound, administered plasma, injected penicillin, used electrical suction, stabilized his breathing, and prepared him for surgery. The German nurses watched in disbelief. The Americans were saving a man their own system had abandoned. Erica whispered, This is not how enemies behave." The American chief nurse turned to her. "In medicine, there are no enemies, only patients." It was the single most destabilizing sentence they had ever heard. That night, back in the holding tent, none of the 9 nurses slept. Ilse broke first. What if everything we believed was wrong? No one answered. Hours earlier, they had watched American doctors save a German life with penicillin, plasma, and skill the Reich had denied them. They had watched American nurses, women of different races, work as equals, without hierarchy built on ideology. They had witnessed a medical system run not by political doctrine, but by scientific necessity. And for the first time in years, they felt something dangerous. Doubt. The next day, the turning point deepened. The nurses were assigned to a ward supervised by Lieutenant Ellen Powell, an African-American nurse. In Nazi doctrine, a woman like her was classified as inferior, incapable of scientific reasoning, unfit for medical authority. Yet here she stood, calm, precise, commanding the ward with confidence earned through training and experience. Within 10 minutes, she corrected Greta's sterile technique. "You touch that with an unsterile hand. Clean it again." Her tone was professional but firm. Greta wanted to protest. Her ideology demanded it, but she could not. Because Powell was right. The moment shattered decades of indoctrination. This was not a political argument. This was not propaganda. This was competence, undeniable, direct, real. For the first time, the nurses began to understand. The Reich had lied to them about medicine. The Reich had lied to them about race. The Reich had lied to them about the world. On the third day, something happened that would stay with them forever. During a lull in the ward, an American doctor approached and said, "If you want to learn, ask anything." He meant it. He taught them how suction machines worked, how to set up an IV line correctly, how to maintain a sterile field, how to use ether and cyclopropane, how to prepare instruments for rapid autoclaving, how to track a patient's progress scientifically. He explained without condescension, without hostility. He treated them not as prisoners, but as colleagues. It was the final seed planted in a transformation that was now irreversible. In the days ahead, the nurses would enter deeper into the American medical system, working side by side with their former enemies, caring for German prisoners, learning techniques they had only read about in outdated textbooks. The turning point had happened. Their old beliefs had begun to crack. Their confidence in Nazi medical ideology was collapsing. But the next stage, the true hell within, would not come from American technology or American training. It would come from what they would soon learn about themselves, their profession, and the regime they had served. For the 9 German nurses, hell did not begin with bombs, or with the roar of artillery, or with the screams of wounded soldiers trapped in Cherbourg. Hell began when they stepped into an American hospital tent and saw a system that made everything they believed collapse within minutes. Hell was not fire, hell was truth. It came quietly through bright surgical lamps, clean instruments, and treatments they had never imagined possible. It came through routines so advanced they felt like intruders from another century. But the deepest wound was not technical, it was ideological. Because every minute spent inside the American medical system exposed a lie they had lived under for years. After 3 days of observation, the American command assigned the nurses to work directly inside the hospital. They were split among 3 areas: shock ward, the most intense unit; Ward 7, where German POWs received care equal to American soldiers; supply and sterilization, where abundance existed on a scale they had never imagined. This was not training. This was confrontation. For the first time, they handled the wounds of their own countrymen using American equipment, American drugs, and American methods. And every action, cleaning wounds, administering plasma, checking vitals, made it clearer. Their entire medical world had been built on scarcity, obedience, and ideology. The American world was built on science, planning, and humanity. The moment that shattered them came in the afternoon of their first shift. A young German soldier, Hans Loh, 21, was brought in with a deep shrapnel wound and advanced sepsis. In the bunker at Cherbourg, this would have been a death sentence. In the Eastern Front, Ilse had watched dozens die from the same condition. In Germany, she had learned to accept it as inevitable. But the Americans did not accept it. Colonel Wilson ordered, "High-dose penicillin, repeat every 3 hours." A nurse prepared the injection immediately. 90,000 units in a single dose. To Ilse, this was the impossible. Germany rationed penicillin by the drop. Some hospitals had never seen it at all. And here in a field tent, the Americans used it like water. Within hours, the boy's fever lowered. Within a day, his infection stabilized. Within 3 days, he no longer needed amputation. Ilse walked out of the tent shaking. She sat on a wooden crate, covered her face and cried, not from relief but from grief. She whispered, "My God, how many could we have saved?" No one answered, because they all knew the truth. They had lost hundreds, not because they lacked skill, but because they had served a system that denied them the tools to save lives. The next blow came when they were assigned to audit the American Supply Depot. Inside a long canvas structure cooled with electric fans, they found 6 large refrigerators filled with plasma, crates of penicillin stacked to the ceiling, boxes of sterile bandages, replacement suction devices, scalpels sealed in factory packaging, sutures, clamps, syringes, gloves, all in surplus. The German nurses stood paralyzed. "This is a month of supplies for an entire front line," Greta whispered. The American supply officer corrected her. "No, this is 1/10 of what we have in Normandy." Greta felt dizzy. 1/10. The American war machine was not improvising. It was manufacturing medicine the way it manufactured tanks, on industrial scale. 3 days later, another group of German POWs arrived. Among them were 2 men the nurses recognized, soldiers they had treated in the bunker and believed dead. They had been left behind when the underground hospital collapsed. Now Americans were fighting to save them. One was Paul Reiner, barely alive, septic, dehydrated, delirious. American doctors did not hesitate. They transfused plasma, administered high-dose penicillin, performed debridement, used electric suction and oxygen, stabilized his vitals, and within hours he was breathing normally. Ilse turned away, tears running down her face. "The Americans saved a German life," she said quietly, "a life our own system left to die." It was a moment none of them ever forgot. The next shock was the most personal. At Ward 7, the nurses were placed under the supervision of African American medical personnel, sergeants and lieutenants with full authority over the ward. In Nazi doctrine, these were people labeled inferior, people the Reich claimed were incapable of scientific work. But in the American hospital, they demonstrated skill far beyond what the German nurses knew. On her first shift, Erica made a mistake in sterile handling. Sergeant William Carter corrected her calmly. "You touch that with an unsterile hand. Clean it again." There was no hostility, only professionalism. Erica's face burned, not from embarrassment, but because she realized she had been lied to her entire life. Carter added without judgment, "I correct you because the patient deserves better, not because you're German." The sentence cut deeper than any criticism. A week later, they attended a briefing by Colonel Henry Misch, commander of the POW medical program. He said, "In this hospital, we treat based on medical need, not ideology, not nationality, not race. And then, if we refuse treatment to prisoners, we are no better than those who turn medicine into a tool of politics." The room fell silent. Every nurse knew exactly what he meant. For the first time, they were forced to confront a truth they did not want to face. German wartime medicine had served ideology, not humanity, and they had been part of it. A few days later, an American doctor, Joseph Barnett, began teaching them advanced techniques. Then he handed them a list of major medical discoveries: immunology, chemotherapy, blood typing, biochemistry, infectious disease research. He pointed to the names. Most were Jewish scientists, scientists expelled from Germany, scientists whose research the Reich had erased. Erica stood up, shaking. "No, that cannot be true." Barnett simply replied, Science does not care about race. Only politics does. The nurses stared at the list, horrified. They realized they had not only lost tools and technology, they had lost entire generations of knowledge, cast out by an ideology that valued purity over truth. That night, none of the nurses spoke. They lay awake in their cots, listening to the distant engines of American trucks. Ilse finally whispered, "We served a system that gave us the wrong enemy." Greta answered, "We believe because we wanted to believe." Erica said nothing. Her hands were trembling. Hell was not the bunker. Hell was not the wounds. Hell was not the battle. Hell was the realization that they had been wrong, not by accident, but by design. The greatest collapse came weeks later, in a large ward converted into a screening room. The Americans played footage from the liberated concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The nurses watched skeletal figures being carried to makeshift infirmaries. They saw children dying from tuberculosis and starvation. They saw rooms piled with corpses, untreated, abandoned, forgotten. Erica ran outside and vomited. Greta collapsed into a chair, sobbing. Ilse covered her face with both hands and whispered, "We were nurses. How did we not know?" An American doctor answered quietly, "You didn't know because they didn't want you to know." That sentence changed them forever. Over the following weeks, the nurses no longer resisted American training. They embraced it. They learned proper sterile technique, plasma management, penicillin dosing, modern surgical assistance, patient advocacy, evidence-based practice, ethical medical conduct. They began taking notes obsessively. They asked questions. They challenged procedures, something forbidden in Germany. They started thinking like American nurses. They were no longer followers, they were becoming practitioners with agency. By the time summer turned to fall, the 9 nurses were not the same women who had emerged from the bunker at Cherbourg. The ideology that once shaped them had been dismantled from within, not by force, but by exposure to a superior system of medicine and a superior moral framework. But their journey was not over. They would soon be transported across the Atlantic to massive American hospitals and to training programs unlike anything in Europe, to a nation whose medical philosophy would reshape their lives. And when they returned to Germany after the war, they would carry with them the seeds of an entirely new medical era. In August 1944, as the fighting in Normandy intensified and the American advance pushed deeper into France, the 9 German nurses were ordered onto a convoy moving towards Cherbourg's port. They believed they were being transferred to a prison camp. They were wrong. A Liberty ship waited for them at the harbor, its steel hull towering over the ruins of the port. The SS Charles W. Elliot, one of the mass-produced giants of American industry, was about to take them far beyond France, far beyond the war, far beyond everything they had ever known. From the cracked concrete of a destroyed bunker, they now stepped onto a vessel that symbolized the full industrial power of the United States. As the crane arms swung overhead and cargo was loaded with mechanical rhythm, Greta Hoffman whispered, "We aren't being taken to a camp. We're being taken into the future." No one disagreed. The bunk rooms were plain. The food was simple, but the hospital deck, that was something they had never imagined in their lives. On board were brightly lit operating rooms, functioning X-ray equipment, a refrigeration system for plasma, anesthetic machines, electric suction, sterilized instruments sealed in metal cases, fully equipped medical stations. Ilse Bauer stared at the equipment, stunned. If we had even a fraction of this in Crimea, thousands would still be alive. It was a statement spoken without bitterness, only recognition. They finally understood that the American advantage was not luck, not accident, not propaganda. It was design. During the Atlantic crossing, the nurses were allowed, with supervision, to assist in medical duties. Those 14 days transformed them. Case 1. Appendectomy in a storm. A young American soldier developed acute appendicitis during rough seas. The ship was shaking violently, but the surgeons worked with steady hands under electric light, guided by suction pumps and anesthesia equipment. The next morning he was already sitting up. To the Germans, it felt like witnessing a different branch of medicine. Not the one they had practiced, but the one they had been denied. Case 2. A German POW saved with American resources. A German prisoner arrived with severe skin infection and high fever. In German field conditions, he would have died within days. But on the Liberty ship, he received plasma, was cleaned and disinfected, received high-dose penicillin, was placed under warming lamps, monitored closely. After 4 days, he was stable. Greta spoke quietly as if ashamed. They treat our wounded like their own. Why? No one had an answer. Case 3. A lesson that hurt more than any bombardment. One night, Lieutenant Harold Warren found Erica struggling with instruments. He said, "Don't memorize the steps. Understand why each step matters." It was not just instruction, it was liberation. For the first time, a superior officer expected her to think, not obey, to question, to analyze, to reason. She realized American nursing was not servitude, it was responsibility. When the ship docked in Norfolk and the nurses boarded the train, the windows became frames showing them a country they never imagined existed. Hospitals lit across entire city blocks. Ambulances lined up at night. Medical schools operating at full capacity. Clinics in every district. Pharmacies with shelves full, even in wartime. In Richmond, they saw the Medical College of Virginia, bigger than the largest pre-war hospitals in Germany. In Philadelphia, the skyline was dominated by healthcare complexes. In Washington, Red Cross volunteers handed out packages to German POWs, toiletries, chocolate, writing materials. Ilse whispered, "If this is their medicine in war, what is it like in peace?" No one dared to respond, because the answer was already overwhelming. On July 21, 1944, Glennon General Hospital in Oklahoma became German POW General Hospital No. 1. It felt like a city, 1,690 beds, 28 wards, 12 operating theaters, 8 POW treatment wings, dedicated sterilization and pharmacy departments, research units, public health classrooms. Here the nurses were not prisoners performing forced labor. They were students, assistants, collaborators. And slowly they became something more. Lieutenant Colonel Dorothy Whitman addressed them directly. "Your loyalty is to the patient, not to the government, not to ideology." The words struck them harder than artillery. "In this hospital," she continued, "you speak up if something is wrong, even if a doctor made the mistake. In Nazi Germany, questioning a superior was unthinkable. Here it was required. The Germans did not know how to respond, not at first, but the seed had been planted. In the following weeks, American doctors taught them evidence-based practice, sterile technique, blood banking, epidemiology, wound management, antibiotic strategy, patient rights. Each lesson undermined years of indoctrination. Greta recalled her racial medicine courses, lessons built on pseudoscience and propaganda. Here, everything was measured, tested, proven. Here, medicine served people, not ideology. In spring 1945, Glennon's main ward was turned into a screening hall. American officers played the footage from the liberated camps Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The nurses saw the starving, the sick, the untreated, bodies piled like cordwood, children left to die, rooms without medicine, patients denied care based on race. Erica ran outside and collapsed, vomiting violently. Greta sobbed uncontrollably. Ilsa trembled, her hands covering her face. They were nurses, and they had been complicit in a system that used medicine to harm, not to heal. A doctor spoke quietly. "You didn't know, because they didn't want you to know." The final lie had been torn away. In the months that followed, something remarkable happened. The 9 nurses studied American manuals, mastered plasma handling, practiced proper anesthesia support, learned sterilization protocols, took notes obsessively, corrected each other, began advocating for patients, questioned procedures, and adopted the American model voluntarily. They were no longer servants of an ideology. They were becoming true medical professionals. Between late 1945 and 1946, the nurses were repatriated to Germany. They carried certificates of American medical training, manuals on public health, guidelines for epidemic control, simplified triage systems, instructions for setting up clinics with minimal supplies, training methods for new nurses, a new ethical foundation. When they arrived, Germany lay in ruins. 60% of hospitals had been destroyed. Millions were displaced. Disease was spreading. Antibiotics were scarce. But they had the tools. Not just technical, but moral. And they began rebuilding. Over the next decade, these nurses and others like them transformed German medicine. They helped establish more than 15 new nursing schools, blood bank networks modeled on American systems, standardized sterilization procedures, evidence-based nursing diagnosis, patient-centered care, modern public health programs. By the 1950s, many German nursing institutions were led by former POW nurses. Women trained not by ideology, but by science and compassion. The medical revival of post-war Germany was built on their shoulders. 50 years after the war, surviving nurses gathered and issued a written statement. It said, "We served the Nazi regime as nurses and became American prisoners as human beings. America showed us what medicine truly is. We learned that medicine corrupted by ideology becomes a weapon." We returned to Germany with knowledge and responsibility. And their final words, "Medicine must serve life. If it does not, it serves nothing." When the 9 nurses stepped out of the underground hospital at Cherbourg, they believed they were surrendering. What they did not know was that they were crossing a threshold from darkness into light, from obedience into understanding, from ideology into humanity. They were not defeated, they were transformed. And through that transformation, they carried home the most powerful weapon America possessed. Not bombs, not tanks, not industry, but a vision of medicine, built on science, on dignity, and on compassion for all who suffer. It was the most profound victory of the American medical system, won not by force, but by healing.